In a surprise to a lot of people, presidential candidate Ramaswamy has proposed raising the voting age from 18, where it was set during the Vietnam War, to 25, unless, of course, a person qualifies through military service or by passing something like a citizenship test. Good morning. My name is Dr. Sean Williams, and we're here today to talk about maybe what are some of the motivations behind this kind of a proposal. He suggests it's because he wants to make sure that the people who are voting are informed and knowledgeable American citizens, but there may be a more sinister connection between his choice of the age of 25 as opposed to some other age. Here to join me in the conversation is Katie. Katie, good morning. Thank you very much for joining me today. How are you doing?
Good morning. I'm doing good. I'm excited to be here and talk about this because it was very interesting to research, and I think I'm kind of passionate about this topic, honestly.
Where did the passion come from?
Well, I think it's just from seeing what's happening in this hidden, I don't want to say agenda, that sounds too much like a buzzword, but that's kind of what it is, trying to suppress some votes.
Yeah. So let's start off for the viewers at home, and I want to back up for a second so that they have an idea of what might be happening here. The allegation is, I'll go ahead and lay the allegation on the table, the voter suppression allegation. The allegation is that Ramaswamy has a problem with Gen Z voters, which is interesting, particularly since he specifically has been appealing to voters on TikTok, basically trying to, on the one hand, mobilize millennial voters to his side while having a proposal that would effectively disenfranchise Gen Z voters. So you're a member of Gen Z. What exactly is Gen Z? Like, what do you consider yourself? How do you consider yourself to be different? Or how do, I should say, experts consider your generation to be different than, say, millennials or Gen Xers?
Okay, great question. So Gen Z is anyone born roughly from 1997 to 2012. So the oldest are 26 and the youngest are turning 11 this year. Gen Z is different because we are the only generation there are members of our generation who have fully been submersed within technology. They have not lived a day in their life without smartphones, social media. That's more the latter half because like I still remember growing up with, more analog things, but still most of my life has been surrounded by so much intake. Also, Gen Z is demographically the most diverse generation that we've seen yet, which means there's more people of different races, religions, sexualities, everything. Gen Z is more diverse.
So that's interesting because whenever, and this might be the direction that we're going in, whenever I'm teaching in my intro to political science class, things like how are Americans generally different? Because how ideologically can I explain or predict a person's ideological position? The most reliable indicator that I can provide is that the more diverse a person is, either in terms of their personal identity or in terms of where they grew up, the more likely that person is to be liberal. And so what you're telling me is that you're a member of the most diverse generation of Americans. Does that also mean that your particular generation is more liberal than the ones that come before?
Yes, they are. Even I would argue that conservative Gen Z are more liberal than other conservatives. So yes, altogether, I would say that Gen Z is a more progressive generation because of how we've grown up and because of who's in our generation. So yeah, we tend to lean left and vote left.
Is that, and again, I teach college, right? And so I've been teaching, I taught millennials, I've taught some Gen Xers, I'm now teaching Gen Zers. And I think I agree with you. I think that your generation definitely leans more left. I can be very critical, and I can say that your generation doesn't necessarily understand like economic issues as well. And so you might lean to the left on economic issues that you don't necessarily understand. That again would be me critical, because I remember my Gen X generation, we were a whole bunch of libertarians. Everybody knew everything about economics. However, when it comes to social issues, I feel like even the most conservative of your generation, when it comes to things like gay marriage, or even abortion might not be the right example, but even with abortion, but especially with gender issues, your generation seems to be far more to the left than 2 generations ago, Gen X, baby boomers especially. Do you think that's fair? Like, is the criticism about economic knowledge fair, or
Yes.
or
I've definitely heard that before about economics. I've heard people tell me like, "Well, you're not going to be as liberal when you get older and start paying taxes." And I'm like, "Well, I pay taxes now, and I still care about people." So, you know, I mean, it is what it is. But yeah, I would agree with that, and I think that it's different with the gender issues, social issues, human rights, things like that, because we see so much in one day just scrolling through social media, and you kind of start to care about other people's lives when you
Mm.
know what's going on. I feel, ignorance is bliss, and when you don't know what's going on, you can just put it out of your mind and worry about the economy more. So
I mean, that's an interesting argument. That's not actually something that I hear a lot of, because most of the time when people talk about the effect of social media, particularly the effect of social media on your generation, they talk about how it's made you more insular, and how all you ever see is yourself, and the world's your vanity is reflected, not you personally, but the vanity of your generation is reflected back to your generation in the social media followers like the Kardashians, who are really probably more millennial than they were Gen Z. I think it's don't want to tell people that. But you're suggesting that it's actually maybe the opposite, that social media has opened up the world in ways that it didn't
yeah,
for us.
which can be good and bad. So I think in the best case scenario, it can highlight other people's problems and make you more aware, cause more concern for people, political issues, things like that. But in the worst case scenario, it can be like information overload, and
Mm,
um, it just that's no good.
yeah, I can see that. I've had a number of conversations in classes, or just privately with recent graduates. Specifically, we've been talking about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that's currently happening.
Yeah,
And there's an awful lot of information that older generations have had 2 decades to process. And we
yeah,
have a very different relationship with Israel than your generation does. I think for your generation, it's not that you didn't know that Israel existed. This conflict that was part of my childhood hasn't really hit your generation yet. And it's definitely apparent that the amount of information you guys are receiving very, very quickly is kind of hitting you guys
hmm
pretty hard.
yeah,
Okay, so I think, and I agree with you. I think that your generation, and all the statistics, all the demographics, pull-up charts, it all agrees that especially on gender issues, your generation is further to the left. On economic issues, you are as well. When it comes to things like socialized medicine, and or even socialized education, which you are in. Your generation has more people in college than any previous generation. Your generation also wants college to be free more than any previous generation. Go figure.
that checks out.
Yeah, it seems reasonable. So if your generation is more liberal, you can kind of see why maybe the Republican Party might not necessarily want you guys participating in the political system.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. It's kind of a threat, I think, especially since it's estimated that between 2020 and 2024 elections, 15.4 million more Gen Z people will be eligible to vote. Now, young voter turnout isn't always the best, so how many of those 15.4 million will actually show up, we don't know. But we do know that that's a lot of people. And if that many people joined the electorate and actually chose to vote, the Republican Party would have an issue.
Yeah. So if we do some quick math, we typically assume that in that first 4 years that you learn to vote, voter turnout is in the 25% range. For 25 to 30% typically, right? Overall, it's like 60%. Older voters are much more likely to vote. Younger voters are much less likely to vote for lots of reasons. So if out of 15 million voters, 20% of them show up, that's 3 million. So you're looking at 3 to 4 million voters. If your generation demographically is 65 or 70% more likely to be liberal, then that means that you're looking at 1.5 to 2 million votes swinging to the Democratic Party.
Mhm.
Won the last presidential election by 3 million votes. So that's a 4.5 to 5 million vote problem, and it gets worse every 4 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could see how this might be a problem. Okay, so I started the show. A problem if for Republicans, not for Democrats, obviously. So I started the broadcast, and we were talking about Ramaswamy's point or his argument that you should have to be at least 25 to vote unless you join the military. And if you join the military, you're probably less likely to be in the liberal portion of the Gen Z camp, or if you've passed something roughly the equivalent of a citizenship test, which also requires a significant time commitment. In your research, are there any other things that you feel that the Republican Party is championing, institutional reforms or efforts to block reforms that you think might have a Gen Z element to them?
Yes, definitely. So in several states, they have passed many bills that are under this facade of election integrity and trying to get rid of voter fraud, which we've been hearing since 2020 election. Um, and most of these bills are trying to suppress the vote. All the votes, but they really target the young vote and other marginalized groups. One of these is restricting what you can use at the poll to vote. So before in some states, you'd be able to bring like a utility bill or just anything that like has your name on it to prove that you are who you say you are and you can vote. But I can't remember which state it was exactly. There's several that are trying to do things like this, but they brought it down to only 4 things that you can use to ID yourself. I think it's a driver's license, state issued driver's license. That's important. Social security card, social security number, things like that. So that's one way. But then in New Hampshire, which is the state that probably has the most out of state college students at their schools, they've passed some bills as well. They're trying to limit voter access as well with the IDs. They've made it a law that you can't use your voter ID card or no, your student ID card to vote.
Even
And,
though
and all these students that live out of state, and if they live like 5-10 hours away, all their stuff's at home. They have to make an extra trip home just to get what they need, and then mail-in ballot. I mean, what's the point of a mail-in ballot if you have to go home and get your social security card?
and that's even though student identification, if you go to a state school, is still a government issued ID.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you're still getting it from a government institution as opposed to now. One thing that I want to point out to people who are watching, this is not necessarily a well-known fact because only about a third of Americans have traditionally gone to college, and even most college students that know this. But as a college student, you have the ability to choose to either vote in your home residence where you came from or at the address that you're using while you're living at college, even if you don't change your driver's license. Whereas with most people, you have to change your driver's license to change your legal residence. According to the United States Supreme Court and federal law, that isn't true for college students. And so if I hear what you're saying, you're suggesting that some of these efforts have really been geared towards keeping college students from voting in elections in college towns as opposed to in their hometowns where they would have a difficult time voting. Okay. So I want to push back just a little bit. If you're the state of New Hampshire, I could understand why you wouldn't necessarily want a bunch of people from out of state coming and raiding your elections, whether they're college students or not. And so I could kind of see how that might be a problem. But then again, I guess if those college students voted with the direction that your political party wanted them to vote, you would probably let them vote.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's look at Florida. Florida's done the same thing. there's no statistic about how there's so many out-of-state college students in Florida. I mean, there are out-of-state just like any other school, but there's a lot of in-state. Florida's a big state. If you wanna go to a school in South Florida and you live in North Florida, you could have, like, a 12 to 16-hour drive ahead of you. So, even that, you're still in state. You're still voting for state senators, for, the same people, but you're you live 12 hours away. Your mom doesn't wanna mail you your Social Security card. That's a risk, you know?
Yeah,
You got your mail-in ballot sent to school, but what's the point? You don't have all these things to be able to vote.
that's very reasonable. So whenever I think about then some of the other innovations that came out of COVID, for example, if I have a mail-in ballot, I can either put a postage stamp on the mail-in ballot in the 2020 election. I
Mhm.
can either put a postage stamp on the mail-in ballot and mail it off. Or in the 2020 election, I was allowed to give it to somebody and they could take it to a drop box. And a number of states have tried to ban that practice as well.
Yes.
Do you think that, and again, they're arguing that it's voter security, that they want to make sure that
Yeah.
people aren't stealing elections. That sounds like a very reasonable argument, but it sounds like you think that that might be targeting your generation as well.
Yeah, so I would agree that it was, um, for a good reason to, pass these laws and limit things, except when you look at where these bills are being passed and where these bills are attempting to be passed. Not all of them do pass, but it's very interesting to see where. It's in swing states and states that lean left, and even within states that aren't, um, very Democrat, these effects are taking place in Democratic areas, like Georgia, for example.
Mm.
So there's 4 counties in Georgia, Fulton, Cobb, and Gwinnett that are very large and very Democratic. So in the
And
2020
also, I'll
election.
point out,
Yeah.
also very ethnically diverse
Yes.
relative to the rest.
Yes. Yes. So there's a bunch of different people, different type of people living within these 4 counties in Georgia. In the 2020 election, they had 107 drop boxes for mail-in ballots that anybody could go to at any time to drop off their mail-in ballot, vote by mail, whether you're, um, disabled, you live far away, um, you can't be there on election day, just any of these kind of reasons. That number has dropped from 107 to 25 for about 500,000 people to vote by mail. But then you look at Utah, a red state, um, they also used drop boxes significantly in the 2020 election, but there were no cuts made to their drop boxes. And they still have 11 times more drop boxes than those 4 counties in Georgia, and those 4 counties in Georgia have more people in their whole county than in the state of Utah.
Well, maybe it's just that Mormons don't steal elections, and Southern Baptists do. I don't.
Yeah, that's a real convenient argument, Dr. Williams.
I understand your point. And again, we're being a little bit cynical, but I don't think that we're being particularly silly. Like this is potentially a very real problem. And out of curiosity, so one of the things that that we know to be true about millennials, you'd said earlier in the broadcast that people tell you that whenever you start paying taxes, you become more conservative. And
Mhm.
that has been true with every generation up to the millennials. And
Yeah.
with millennials, as they've gotten older, they haven't actually drifted to the right at the same rate as Gen X or the baby boomers did. And we're thinking that the same thing might be true with your generation. That rightward drift that happens when you start paying taxes doesn't seem to be happening with the 26, 25, and 24-year-olds the same way that it did to my generation whenever we were 26, 25, 24.
Mhm.
So if I understand what you're saying, it sounds like the Republican Party is on a ticking time bomb. That they can try to repress votes for a little bit now, but that at some point there's going to be a reckoning. Does that?
I think so. I don't know if it'll be, um, big, if it'll be obvious, if it'll be The Republican Party has not won anything in the last, like, 4 elections, but I think that, it it will, yeah, it'll be a problem for them if they can't garner the young vote and get that vote and encourage those people to then go out and vote. Yeah, it's gonna be a problem, but they're not trying to do that. They're not trying to get these votes. They're going the other way. They're like, "Well, if we can't convince them, if we can't join them, let's just beat them," which they're trying to do, so we'll see if that happens.
A great line. Uh, so out of curiosity, I'm curious about this because of a lot of the arguments that you've made. You said that your generation was the most racially diverse, ethnically diverse, whichever term you choose to use, and both are applicable to your generation for lots of reasons. We could talk about it if you want to. Do you see that there's a relationship between age and race and age and gender? Do you think that by targeting age, they're really trying to just target race, or that they're really just trying to target gender, or do you think that it's really just about the age question? What do you think?
I think it's all mixed in together, with age, race, gender. Mainly age and race is what I found when doing research, 'cause, these bills that they're passing, they restrict younger votes, but they also restrict, like I said earlier, marginalized groups. So, like, the drop boxes, people may do mail-in ballots because they're working when the election is going on and they can't get off, or they're not as able-bodied. They have to, that's easier for them. Maybe they have children, and the one day they can have someone watch their kids, they go drop off their ballot in the mailbox. Um, and also, in those Georgia counties, like you said, very diverse region, and those people have now been affected by how many places they can go send in their ballot. So, yes, it's very, it affects more than just age. I also saw, one article that was talking about how a bill was passed. They outlawed passing out food and water in election lines, and people that wait in election lines are usually marginalized groups. So they're creating these almost inhumane conditions just they just want to cast their vote. They just want to do their American right, their privilege to vote and participate. But people are trying to stop it.
I remember I was in grad school during the first Obama presidential election, which tells you how long ago that was. But we were in grad school and having a conversation with one of the faculty members, and we're talking about how long the lines were. Actually, this might have even been 2004 with the Mitt Romney and George Bush campaign. This was 2004 because it was in Ohio, and there are these very long lines that were forming in Ohio, and people were like, "Oh, look how excited people are to show up and vote." And this grizzled old college professor said, "It's not that people are more excited to vote; it's that there are fewer places for them to vote." And it turns out that he was actually completely accurate. That what Ohio had done in the urban areas is they had reduced the number of voting locations in minority areas of urban cities, which then meant that it was harder for minorities to vote. They had to stand in line longer. Whereas in white communities, they had more voting booths and more voter locations. The lines were much shorter, and it was an effective tool for voter suppression. And his argument at the time was that that was probably the reason why John Kerry lost the presidential election, was because they had systematically made voting lines longer to discourage voters. And so, well, this has been a really uplifting conversation. Now, I will say, being a little bit older, the problem of voter security is a legitimate one, except for the fact that we can't find any statistical evidence to suggest that elections are actually stolen at the ballot box. They're almost always stolen with the rules or with how votes are counted, or almost never are elections on the national scale influenced. Local elections, yeah, but at the national scale, very rarely can a statewide election be stolen by stuffing ballot boxes. It's just too many votes, too much information. Well, thank you for joining me today. I greatly appreciate it. And thank you all of you at home who joined us for this conversation. Also, I encourage you to join us next time. We're going to be talking about another fun and exciting conversation, the debate about whether or not employees of state and local or federal governments should be getting pay raises. It's a fairly sophisticated conversation where a lot of people argue that if you work for the government, that you should be working something as a public servant and you should make less money. And yet here in the state of Kentucky, it turns out that our part-time legislature that's only supposed to be working 2 months out of the year makes more money than the average Kentuckian who has a full-time job. So again, thank you very much for joining us for our conversation. I hope to see you again soon. Good afternoon and God bless.